1 Samuel chapter 17. David slays Goliath with a sling and stone. Now the Philistines assembled their armies to battle. They were gathered at Socoh of Judah. They camped at Ephes Dammim, between Socoh and Ezekah. Saul and the men of Israel gathered and camped in the valley of Elah, then lined up in a battle array against the Philistines. The Philistines were standing on the mountain on one side, and Israel was standing on the mountain on the other side, with the valley between them. Then a champion stepped out from the camp of the Philistines named Goliath, from Gath, whose height was 6 cubits and a span. He had brought a helmet on his head and a breastplate of scale armor. The weight of the bronze breastplate was 5,000 shekels. He also had silver shin guards on his legs and a bronze javelin slung between his shoulders. The shaft of his spear was like a weaver's beam, and the head of his spear weighed 600 shekels of iron, and his shield-bearer was marching ahead of him. Then he stood and shouted to the ranks of Israel, saying to them, "Why come out to line up in battle array? Am I not the Philistine, and aren't you Saul's servants? Choose for yourselves a man, and let him come down to me. If he is able to fight with me and kill me, then we will become your slaves. But if I prevail against him and kill him, then you will become our slaves and serve us." The Philistine added, "Today I defy the ranks of Israel. Give me a man so we may fight together." But when Saul and all Israel heard these words of the Philistines, they were dismayed and very terrified. Now David was the son of a certain Ephrathite man of Bethlehem of Judah, whose name was Jesse. He had 8 sons, and during the days of Saul the man was old, advanced in years among them. Now the 3 oldest sons of Jesse had already left and gone after Saul to battle. The names of his 3 sons who went to the battle were Eliab the firstborn, the second Abinadab, and the third Shammah. David was the youngest, so the 3 oldest followed David. Now David would go back and forth from Saul to tending his father's sheep by Bethlehem. For 40 days that Philistine would come out every morning and evening to present himself. Then Jesse said to his son David, "Take now for your brothers an ephah of this roasted grain and these 10 loaves, and carry them quickly to the camp to your brothers. Also take these 10 slices of cheese to the captain of their 1,000, and check out the welfare of your brothers, and bring back the token from them. They are with Saul and all the men of Israel in the valley of Elah, fighting with the Philistines." So David rose up early in the morning, left the flock with the keeper, took the provisions, and went as Jesse had commanded him. When he reached the camp, the army was going out to the battle line, shouting the war cry. Israel and the Philistines drew up their battle lines, army against army. Then David left his baggage in the care of the baggage keeper and ran to the battle line and entered to check out his brother's welfare. But as he was talking with them, behold, the champion, the Philistine from Gath named Goliath, was coming up from the ranks of the Philistines, and he spoke these same words, and David heard them. Upon seeing him, all the men of Israel fled from him in great fear. All the men of Israel were saying, "Have you seen this man who keeps coming up? Surely he is coming up to defy Israel. The man who kills him, the king which will enrich him with great riches, give him his daughter in marriage, and make his father's house tax-free in Israel." Then David asked the men who were standing by him, saying, "What will be done for the man who kills this Philistine and takes away the reproach from Israel? For who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the ranks of the living God?" The people answered him with the same speech, saying, "Thus it will be done for the man who strikes him down." Now when Eliab, his oldest brother, heard him speaking to the men, Eliab's anger was kindled against David. "Why have you come down here?" he asked. "So with whom did you leave those few sheep in the wilderness? I know your insolence and the wickedness of your heart, for you've come down here to watch the battle." "What have I done now?" David said. "It was only a question." Then he turned away from him toward someone else and asked the same question. So the people gave him the same answer as before. The words that David said were overheard and reported before Saul, so he was taken to him. David said to Saul, "Let no one's heart fail because of him. Your servant will go and fight with this Philistine." Then Saul said to David, "You can't go fight the Philistine, for you're just a youth, and he's been a warrior since his youth." But David said to Saul, "Your servant has been tending his father's sheep. When a lion or bear came and carried off a lamb out of the flock, I went out after it, struck it down, and rescued the lamb out of its mouth. If it rose up against me, I grabbed him by its fur, struck it, and killed it. Your servant has killed both the lion and the bear, so this uncircumcised Philistine will become like one of them, since he has defiled the ranks of the living God." Then David said, "Adonai, who has delivered me from the paw of the lion, from the paw of the bear, will deliver me from the hand of the Philistine." "Go," said Saul to David, "and may Adonai be with you." Then Saul clothed David with his own garb, put a bronze helmet on his head, and clothed him in armor. David strapped his sword on his garment and tried to walk, but he was not used to it. So David said to Saul, I cannot walk in these, for I am not used to them. So David took them off. Then he took his staff in his hand, chose 5 smooth stones from the valley, and put them in the pocket of the shepherd's bag that he had. And with his sling in hand, he approached the Philistine. Meanwhile, the Philistine drew near and approached David, with his shield bearer in front of him. Now when the Philistine looked and saw David, he disdained him, for he was just a ruddy boy with a handsome appearance. Then the Philistine said to David, Am I a dog that you come to me with sticks? Then the Philistine cursed David by his gods. The Philistine said to David, Come to me, so I may give your flesh to the birds of the sky and the beasts of the field. Then David said to the Philistine, You are coming to me with a sword, a spear, and a javelin, but I am coming to you in the name of Adonai Zavat, God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. This very day Adonai will deliver you into my hand, and I will strike you down and take your head off of you, and I will give you the carcasses of the Philistines' camp today to the birds of the sky and the wild beasts of the earth, and all the earth will know that there is a God in Israel. And so all the assembly will know that Adonai delivers, not with sword and spear, for the battle belongs to Adonai, and he will give you into our hands. When the Philistine rose and began to advance, drawing near to meet David, David ran quickly toward the battle line to meet the Philistine. David put his hand in his bag, took from it a stone, and slung it, striking the Philistine on his forehead. The stone sank into his forehead so that he fell on his face to the ground. So David prevailed over the Philistine with a sling and a stone, struck the Philistine down and killed him. Since there was no sword in David's hand, David ran, stood over the Philistine, picked up his sword, drew it from its sheath, slew him, and cut off his head with it. When the Philistines saw that their champion was dead, they fled. Then the men of Israel and Judah rose up, shouted, and pursued the Philistines all the way to the valley up to the gates of Ekron. The slain Philistines fell down along the way to Shearim, even up to Gath and Ekron. When Benaiah returned from chasing the Philistines, they plundered their camp. David took the head of the Philistines and brought it to Jerusalem, but he put his armor in his own tent. Now when Saul saw David go out against the Philistine, he asked Abner, the commander of the army, Abner, whose son is this boy? Abner said, As your soul lives, your majesty, I don't know. So the king said, Then find out whose son this young man is. So when David returned from killing the Philistine, Abner took him and brought him before Saul with the head of the Philistine in his hand. Whose son are you, young man? Saul said to him. David answered, I am the son of your servant Jesse, the Bethlehemite. 1 Samuel chapter 18. Jonathan's covenant love for David. Now it came to pass, when David had finished speaking to Saul, Jonathan's soul was knit to David's soul, and Jonathan loved him as himself. Saul took him that day and did not let him return to his father's house. Then Jonathan cut a covenant with David because he loved him as himself. Jonathan stripped off the robe that was on him and gave it to David along with his armor, his sword, bow, and belt. Saul's jealousy. So David went out wherever Saul sent him and had success. So Saul set him over the men of war. It was pleasing in the eyes of all the people, as well as in the eyes of Saul's courtiers. Upon their coming back, upon David's returning from killing the Philistines, the women came out of all the towns of Israel, singing and dancing in circles to greet King Saul with timbrels, with joy, and with 3-stringed instruments. So the women sang one to another, and as they were dancing, saying, Saul has slain his 1,000s, and David his 10,000s. Then Saul became very angry. They saying was evil in his eyes. And he commented, They've ascribed to David 10,000s, and to me they've ascribed thousands. Now what more does he lack but in the kingdom? So Saul eyed David from that day on. It came about that day that an evil spirit from God came mightily upon Saul, so that he was raving within the palace. While David was playing music with his hand, and he did day by day, Saul had his spear in his hand, and Saul hurled the spear, thinking, I'll pin David to the wall. But David eluded him twice. Now Saul became afraid of David because of Adonai was with him, but had departed from Saul. Therefore Saul removed him from the entourage by appointing him as a captain of thousands. So David went out and came in before the troops. David had success in all his undertakings, since Adonai was with him. When Saul saw that he had great success, he dreaded him. But all Israel and Judah loved David, for he went out and came in before them. Then Saul said to David, Here is my older daughter Merab. I give her to you as a wife. Only continue to be my son of valor and fight Adonai's battle. For Saul thought, My hand needn't be against him. Let the hand of the Philistines be against him. But David replied to Saul, Who am I, and what is my life for my father's family in Israel, that I should become the king's son-in-law? But when it was time to give Saul's daughter Merab to David in marriage, she was given as a wife to Adriel, the Meholathelite, instead. Michal's love for David. Now Saul's daughter Michal loved David. When they told Saul the matter pleased him, Saul thought, I will give her to him, so that she may become a snare to him, and the hand of the Philistines will be against him. So Saul said to David, You can still become my son-in-law even today with the second one. Then Saul commanded his courtiers, Speak with David privately, and say, Behold, the king delights in you, and all his courtiers love you. So now become the king's son-in-law. So Saul's courtiers whispered these words in David's ears, but David said, It is a light thing to you becoming the king's son-in-law, considering that I am a poor man of little account. Saul's courtiers reported back to him what David had said. Then Saul said, Thus you will say to David, The king desires no bridal dowry except 100 foreskins of the Philistines to take vengeance on the king's armies. So Saul schemed to make David fail by the hand of the Philistines. When his courtiers told David these words, the words seemed right in David's eyes to become the king's son-in-law. Before the days were fulfilled, David had arisen, gone with his men, and killed 200 Philistine men. Then David brought their foreskins and gave them in full number to the king to become the king's son-in-law. So Saul gave him Michal, his daughter, as a wife. When Saul saw that and realized that Adonai was with David and that Michal, Saul's daughter, loved him, Saul grew even more afraid of David. Thus Saul became David's enemy for all his days. When the chiefs of the Philistines marched out as often as they came out, David proved more successful than all of Saul's officers, so his name became highly esteemed. 1 Samuel chapter 20. Saul tries to kill David. Now Saul told his son Jonathan and all his courtiers to kill David. But Saul's son Jonathan delighted much in David. So Jonathan informed David, saying, My father Saul is seeking to kill you. So now please be on guard in the morning, and stay in a secret place and hide yourself. I will go out and stand beside my father in the field where you will be, and I will speak with my father about you. If I notice anything, I will tell you. So Jonathan spoke well of David to his father Saul, and said to him, May the king not sin against his servant David, since he has not sinned against you, and since his deeds have been very beneficial for you. For he put his life in his hand and killed the Philistine, and Adonai won a great victory for all of Israel. You saw it and rejoiced, so why would you sin against innocent blood by killing David without a cause? Saul listened to this voice of Jonathan, and Saul swore, As Adonai lives, he will not be put to death. So Jonathan called David, and Jonathan told him all these things. Jonathan brought David to Saul in his presence as before. Once again war broke out, and David marched and fought the Philistines, and inflicted a great slaughter on them, and they fled before him. Yet once again an evil spirit from Adonai came upon Saul as he was sitting in his house with a spear in his hand. As David was playing music with his hands, Saul sought to pin David to the wall with the spear, but he slipped away from Saul's face, so that he drove the spear into the wall. That night David fled and got away. Then Saul sent agents to David's house to watch him in order to kill him in the morning, but David's wife Michal warned him, saying, If you don't escape for your life tonight, tomorrow you will be dead. So Michal lowered David's head down through the window, and thus he went, fled, and escaped. Then Michal took a household idol, laid it in the bed, put a quill of goat's hair at the end of it, at the head, and covered it with a cloth. When Saul sent messengers to arrest David, she said, He's sick. So Saul sent the agents back to see David, saying, Bring him up to me in the bed, so I may put him to death. When the messengers came in, behold, the household idol was in the bed with the quills of goat's hair at its head. Saul then said to Michal, Why have you deceived me like this, and let my enemy get away, so that he escaped? Michal answered Saul, He said to me, Let me go, or I'll kill you. So David fled and escaped, went to Samuel at Ramah, and told him that Saul had done to him all that Saul had done to him. Then he and Samuel went and stayed in Naioth. Saul was told, Behold, David is at Naioth in Ramah. So Saul sent agents to seize David, but they saw a band of prophets prophesying, and Samuel standing and presiding over them. Then the Ruach of God came upon Saul's agents, and they too prophesied. When Saul was told, he sent other agents, and they too prophesied. Then Saul sent a third group of messengers, and they too prophesied. Then he himself went to Ramah, and when he arrived at the great cistern in Seku, he said, Where are Samuel and David? Someone answered, Look, they are at Naioth at Ramah. So he proceeded there to Naioth at Ramah, and the Ruach of God came upon him as well. And he prophesied as he kept walking until he arrived to Naioth at Ramah. Then he too stripped off his clothes, and he too prophesied before Samuel, and lay down naked all the day and all the night. That is why people were saying, Is Saul too among the prophets?